Hey everybody, David the AI Guide here. Happy Sunday. Welcome to another episode, and thanks so much to our subscribers. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I have a question for you today. What do you guys think is going to happen with quantum computing in the next 10 years? Put your comments in the comments and I will get back to you. I'd love to hear what you think. Today we're going to talk about a meeting that was held last week. It was called Grid Connects 2020, and it's a virtual meeting this year, of course, focusing on the state of the electric grid, power generation, and all things that use electricity. So they talked about a lot of different stuff. First, they talked about what was needed in terms of policy to further grow electrification. And that's pretty important, right? Because government policies can either encourage technologies or they can discourage them. And that's usually done through the tax code and whether certain industries get tax subsidies or they pay taxes. Almost all of the energy businesses, by the way, are subsidized, including the big oil companies, and subsidized by billions of dollars, by the way. But Grid Connects was not talking about oil, it was talking about the future of electricity. So the first thing they were talking about once they got to technology was power generation. And really they were talking about what's going to happen to power generation between now and 2050, so the next 30 years. And the forecast was that all electricity will be generated by renewable sources in the next 20 years. So what does that mean? Well, today, still about half of power at least is generated by fossil fuels, mostly natural gas today, but still oil and coal. So the electric grid is complicated, right? They have primary energy plants which create the energy that we normally use, but use of electricity is not even, right? Sometimes it goes way up, sometimes it goes down. One of the peak seasons is in the summer with air conditioning. And so they have extra plants that typically are older and very inefficient and therefore only run at peak demand. And most of those are still oil. But as I said, roughly half of plants today are natural gas and the rest is solar, wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric or dams, and nuclear, of course, nuclear. So what has been happening with power generation in the last 20 years? Well, the major thing that has happened is that 20 years ago, at least half of power was generated by coal-fired power plants. Most of those have been shut down when they came up for relicensing. Why? Because coal is much more expensive now than natural gas. And now the price of renewables dropped dramatically over the last 20 years, so that now solar is virtually the cheapest of all energy sources, with wind right behind it, and then natural gas. So you can see that with the current cost structure, things will continue to move to wind and solar. Dams are great, no pollution, but super expensive to build and disruptive to the landscape. And nuclear has a lot of problems, right? I mean, there's been significant problems with nuclear in terms of meltdowns or almost meltdowns like 3 Mile Island in the United States or Chernobyl in Russia. So the technology for nuclear is being rapidly advanced into new technologies, but what do you do with the waste? There's still no solution to that. So in my opinion, nuclear is something that should not be focused on. Also, it's super, super, super expensive, the most expensive to build. The second thing they talked about was the grid. So the grid right now, and we've talked about this before, is highly centralized and split into regions of the United States. And there's an overarching authority that manages the power grid in each of these regions, like the Northeast, the Southeast, the Midwest, the lower South, like Texas, and then the far West has several what they call ISOs, or independent system operators. So all top down now, but what they're predicting is that in the next 20 to 30 years, that top down model will disappear and it will become a distributed grid system with local grids serving local areas. And this is going to be driven by better and better storage. They did talk about storage, but we've talked about that quite a bit, both in the segment I did on different forms of power storage, which was pretty extensive, and then later how Tesla and others have been putting up utility scale battery farms that will store power for hours or days. So what'll that mean? That'll mean that each city basically will have its own grid, and in rural areas, ultimately you will be off the grid. You will have solar and or wind, and you'll have your own battery system, and that technology will continue to get cheaper and cheaper, and you will be independent of the power grid. That'll really prevent power going out a lot, obviously. The final major topic they talked about was EVs, or electric vehicles, and their forecast is that up from about 10% today, in 15 years, electric vehicles, or EVs, will be roughly 50% of the market. And by 2050, it'll be 77% of the market. So by 30 years from now, almost all cars will be electric. However that power is generated or stored, it doesn't matter. The cars will be electric, and fossil fuel use will drop dramatically. So this is very, very interesting. It has a lot of future impacts for the environment favorably, and because fossil fuels have a finite amount that they can extract from the earth, whereas solar and wind are renewable and more or less permanent. This will stabilize the energy grid in the long term. So very interesting conference. These conferences come up quite a bit. I will put a link so that you can see some of the sessions. And if here is real opportunity, right, for careers. I always do careers at the end. They're going to need a lot of people to do this electrical work, to break the grid apart, build the local distributed grids, and the energy storage farms, and the additional solar systems and wind systems. All of this will be high-paying jobs for those who are mechanically inclined, so I highly, highly recommend that. So thanks, and there's a ton of breaking news right now. We'll talk more about that next time. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.